You hear people argue about generations all the time. Boomers ruined everything. Millennials killed everything. Gen Z is changing everything. But there's one generation that almost never gets talked about. They're not loud. They're not constantly online. They're not trying to go viral. They're just there. Generation X, born roughly between the mid-1960s and early 1980s. They're your coworkers who don't complain. Your parents who don't over-explain. The people who helped build the modern world without constantly narrating their lives online. And here's the strange part. Psychologically, they might be the most misunderstood generation alive. Generation X was the first generation to grow up with forced independence, not as a lifestyle choice, as a necessity. Imagine being 8 years old, walking home from school, unlocking the door to an empty house, and knowing nobody would check in for hours. No smartphones, no location tracking, no message asking if you made it home safely. You figured it out. You made food, you did homework, you waited. Millions of kids grew up this way. And while it made them capable, it also taught them something powerful. You can't always rely on someone showing up. That lesson sticks. That empty house did more than create independence. It wired their brains around consequences. When their parents finally got home, rules were simple. Cross the line and you knew immediately. There were no long negotiations, no emotional processing sessions, no endless explanations. Psychologists call this a high-consequence environment, a world where actions and outcomes are tightly connected. That's why Generation X often seems like they're thinking 3 steps ahead. They learned early that every decision has weight. At the same time, they watched adults promise stability and then fail to deliver it. They saw marriages fall apart. They saw layoffs hit loyal workers. They saw institutions say one thing and do another. They were told, work hard, follow the rules, everything will work out. But then the rules changed. So Generation X didn't become hopeful idealists. They became realistic planners. Not cynical, prepared. They learned to expect disruption and emotionally brace for it. This mindset explains something people often misunderstand about them: their distance. Generation X isn't antisocial, they're private. They grew up when mistakes didn't live forever, when embarrassment faded instead of going viral, when personal moments stayed personal. So broadcasting their lives online doesn't feel exciting. To them, it feels risky, because the less people know, the safer you are. That's also where their humor comes from: sarcasm, irony, self-deprecation. It's not detachment, it's armor. They grew up during constant background anxiety, Cold War warnings, nuclear drills, adults talking about catastrophe while telling kids not to worry. When the world feels unstable but nobody addresses it directly, you learn to keep emotional distance just in case. And yet, despite all this, Generation X developed one of the most quietly powerful work ethics you'll ever see. They don't announce it, they don't brand it, they don't talk about grind culture, they just work. Their first jobs came early: paper routes before sunrise, fast food registers without calculators, responsibility before adulthood. These weren't passion projects, they were survival training. They learned competence before confidence. They also watched what happened to loyalty. They saw companies discard people who gave decades of their lives. So Generation X made a shift. They didn't trust systems, they trusted skills. They don't believe a job will save them. They believe being useful will. That's why many of them quietly maintain multiple income streams, not for status, for security. Here's the paradox at the core of Generation X psychology. They are deeply independent and quietly dependable. They won't ask for help. They'll figure it out themselves. They've been doing that since childhood. But when someone else needs help, they show up. No announcement, no credit, no performance. Because that's how friendships were formed when adults weren't around. Their relationship with authority reflects this too. They don't respect titles, they respect competence. If you know what you're doing, they're loyal. If you don't, they disengage immediately. Because they watched authority fail repeatedly, politically, economically, socially. They learned early that power doesn't equal wisdom. Economically, Generation X took hit after hit. Some entered adulthood during recessions. Others were building their careers when financial crises wiped everything out. So they adapted. Not with blind optimism, with redundancy. If nothing lasts, you prepare for the ending. Psychologically, this level of self-reliance has a cost. Generation X is excellent in emergencies, but often uncomfortable asking for support. Not because they lack relationships, but because needing help feels like losing control. They were taught to manage quietly. They also grew up learning differently. Before instant answers, information had friction. You searched, you waited, you worked for understanding. That effort made knowledge stick. They fixed things because that's what people did. You didn't replace things, you repaired them. And that created a powerful belief. Most problems are solvable if you stay patient long enough. Now they're raising children in a world they barely recognize. Constant supervision, permanent visibility, endless documentation. They gave their kids what they never had, attention. But sometimes they wonder what independence was lost in the process, because in their world, being unseen was how you stayed safe. Generation X isn't better than other generations. They're different. They grew up between eras, after the old world cracked and before the new one stabilized. They're the bridge, and bridges don't get applause. They just hold everything together quietly, without asking if anyone noticed. If this resonated with you, subscribe for more psychology deep dives like this, and I'll see you in the next video.